Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story will shake you in ways you're not ready for. You ruined this family. That's what my father said to me in front of everyone. Right there in the kitchen between the rice and the roast, with my mother staring at her plate and my brother pretending he didn't hear. But I heard. I heard every syllable, every pause, every ounce of disgust in his voice. And I didn't say a word. I didn't scream back. I didn't throw a plate. I didn't ask why. I just looked at him. Then I looked around. The kitchen we had shared so many birthdays in. The fridge covered in old magnets and grocery lists. The table that had held every argument like a loyal witness. I picked up my coat. And I walked out. Not for the night. Not for the week. For 5 entire years. You might be asking, what could make a father say something so cruel? What did I do to deserve that kind of exile? And honestly, I asked myself that same question every single day for the next 1,826 days. But it's never just one thing. It's years. It's silence. It's expectation. And somewhere in between all that, I had stopped being a daughter in his eyes and started being a disappointment. Started, I think, the year I dropped out of med school. Or maybe it was when I told them I was dating someone they didn't approve of. Or maybe it was when I stopped going to church every Sunday. I never did drugs. I never stole. I just chose. Differently. And for a man like my father, different was the same as wrong. That Sunday lunch was supposed to be just like the others. Strained but civil. I came late. The moment I walked in, I felt it. The energy, the tension, like a room waiting for an explosion. My mother smiled with that quiet worry behind her eyes. My father didn't look up. My brother asked if I brought wine. I said no. Then we ate in near silence until my father asked, "Are you proud of what you've done?" "What exactly have I done?" I replied. "That's when it happened. You ruined this family." Everyone froze. No one defended me. Not even my mother. My brother cleared his throat and reached for more potatoes. I looked at each of them, waited for someone, anyone, to say something. But all I got was the humming of the fridge and the clinking of forks on plates. That silence, that was the real betrayal. So I stood up. No shouting. No crying. I pushed the chair in slowly. Grabbed my coat. Walked past the sink where I used to help Mom wash dishes as a kid. Past the hallway filled with old photos I wasn't in anymore. I opened the door. And I left. I didn't look back. First I stayed with friends. Then I crashed on a coworker's couch. Then I rented a tiny studio with peeling paint and a heater that sounded like a dying animal. I worked long hours. Picked up writing again, something I loved before life got so loud. I went to therapy. I met new people. I started building a life that didn't orbit around approval. And for the first time I began to wonder, maybe I didn't ruin anything. Maybe I just didn't fit into the version of family they had built. But the guilt never left fully. I missed my mother's cooking. I missed birthdays. I missed laughing with my brother before things got weird. And sometimes in the middle of the night I would hear his voice again, my father's voice, saying it like a verdict. You ruined this family. But I didn't walk back. Not yet. The first year away from home felt like walking through fog. Everything was unfamiliar, from the way I shopped for groceries to how quiet my nights had become. I didn't have anyone reminding me to call back, to check in, to be better. For the first time in my life, I was invisible to the people who once hovered over every choice I made. It was terrifying and weirdly peaceful. I threw myself into work. I took extra shifts, did freelance writing on the side, and slowly built a small portfolio that paid just enough for rent and instant ramen. I went days without speaking to anyone beyond polite interactions. At night, I wrote long journal entries that were half letters to my father and half apologies to myself. The anger didn't come right away. It took time. At first I kept blaming myself. Maybe I had been disrespectful. Maybe I should have just shut my mouth. Maybe keeping the peace was more important than speaking my truth. But slowly something shifted. I began to replay that day over and over, and each time I saw it more clearly. I wasn't the one who shattered the family. I just refused to keep pretending nothing was broken. I made friends who didn't care about my GPA or which university I dropped out of. Friends who sat with me through my silence, who didn't flinch when I said my family cut me off. One of them, Olivia, once said, "You didn't walk out of your family. You walked out of a performance." And that sentence, it stayed with me like a mantra. I started reading more about boundaries, about emotional abuse, about generational trauma. It wasn't some grand revelation. It was slow, like peeling off skin that never fit me right in the first place. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't evil. I was just awake. And I couldn't go back to sleep, not even to make them feel better. Around the second year, I stopped expecting a phone call. The silence from my family wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. I realized my absence wasn't a wound to them. It was a relief. They had already moved on, already repainted the living room, already taken down the photos that included me. That part stung. More than I want to admit. I still had moments of doubt. Especially when the holidays came around and social media exploded with pictures of smiling families in matching pajamas. I would see my cousins, my brother, even my father, still smiling, still celebrating without me. And a part of me wondered, did they ever talk about me? Did they lie and say I was just traveling? Did anyone miss me? I began to find comfort in small rituals. Sunday mornings with a cup of coffee and a walk through the park. Writing stories based on my memories, twisted and rearranged into fiction where I could control the endings. I found healing in creating characters who stood up for themselves, who walked out of rooms they didn't belong in. And yet, deep down, I kept asking the same question: would I ever go back? Not for them. Not to make peace. But for me. Just to see if I could return to the place that shattered me and not feel small anymore. Not feel guilty. Just feel. Then something unexpected happened. I got a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A real, handwritten letter with smudged ink and a shaky signature. From my mother. She didn't say much. Just that she thought of me every time she passed my bedroom door. That she wasn't proud of what happened. That she hoped I was eating well. And at the very bottom, he hasn't changed. But I miss you. I must have read it 20 times. Cried over it. Laughed bitterly. And cried again. It was the first crack in the wall. And it reminded me of something I had buried deep. You can leave to protect your heart. And you can love someone from a distance. But healing sometimes requires you to face the place you bled in. I kept the letter in the top drawer of my desk under a pile of notebooks I barely touched. I couldn't bring myself to answer it. Not because I didn't care, God, I cared more than I wanted to admit, but because I was afraid. Afraid that if I opened the door, even just a crack, everything I'd built over 5 years would come crashing down. That I'd fall back into old patterns, that I'd beg for crumbs of affection, that I'd accept being half-loved just to feel included again. And yet that letter haunted me. I began dreaming of our old house. Of walking down the hallway barefoot, hearing my parents whispering in the kitchen. Of the smell of burnt toast and my mother humming. But even in my dreams, the warmth would vanish. I'd reach for the doorknob and hear it again, his voice low and sharp, "You ruined this family." I'd wake up drenched in sweat, shaking. So I wrote a letter back. Not to send. Just to write. It was 5 pages long. I told her everything. How I cried myself to sleep in the beginning. How I hated them. How I missed them. How I blamed myself. And then how I stopped. I told her about the people I'd met. The version of me they never got to know. The version that didn't walk on eggshells. That didn't apologize for existing. I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope and sealed it. I didn't mail it. But something in me shifted. I was no longer writing for closure. I was writing because I needed to witness my own story, without edits, without denial, without shrinking. A few weeks later my phone buzzed. An unknown number. No name. Just a message. "I know I don't deserve to ask, but can we talk?" My breath caught. I stared at the screen for minutes. I wanted to throw the phone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say yes. It was my brother. He hadn't spoken to me in almost 5 years. Not once. Not even on my birthday. I didn't even know he still had my number. I sat on the floor reading the message again and again. Something about it felt off. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or pressure or a genuine olive branch. After hours of pacing, I replied with one word: "Baby." We didn't talk that night. Or the next. But the door was open now, just enough for the air to change. And change it did. Fully. 3 days later I got another message. This time longer. He said he'd been thinking about me. That mom cried every holiday. That dad was still himself, but quieter. That they didn't talk about what happened, not really, but that it hung in the air, unspoken and heavy. He said he wished he'd said something that day in the kitchen. That he'd never forgotten how I looked when I left. That line shattered me. Because all this time I thought no one had even noticed. that I was a ghost in their memories. But he saw. He remembered. And maybe, just maybe, that meant there was still something there to rebuild. I called Olivia that night. I told her everything. She listened like she always did, without judgment, without interruptions. Then she said something I didn't expect. Maybe going back isn't about them. Maybe it's about you seeing that house with new eyes. I didn't sleep much. The idea kept echoing in my head. Going back, not for forgiveness. Not for peace. But to see it all. The walls, the silence, the table, through the lens of who I'd become. A week later I booked a train ticket to my hometown. Not a dramatic flight. Not some emotional confrontation. Just a slow, steady return. I didn't tell them I was coming. I needed to walk through that door on my own terms. To see if the ghost still lived there. To prove to myself that I could survive standing where I once shattered. Not as the girl who left. But as the woman who refused to stay broken. The train ride was quiet, long, and filled with a kind of silence I hadn't felt in years. Not the tense, suffocating silence of that kitchen. This one was different. This was the silence of intention. Of going back, not because I missed the people, but because I needed to reclaim the space. To see the house, the neighborhood, even the weather through new eyes. Through the eyes of someone who had finally chosen herself. I wore a gray coat that day. One I had bought with my first freelance paycheck. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like armor. On the train I kept picturing the house. The chipped paint. The porch swing. The tiny crack in the third stair on the way up. Every detail came back like a flood. But so did the emotions. The fear, the resentment, the longing. I didn't know which one would hit first when I stepped off the platform. When I arrived in town, I didn't go straight to the house. I walked. Past the bakery where Mom used to buy pastries on Sundays. Past the park where I fell off my bike and cried into my dad's jacket. Past the old bookstore I loved but he never wanted to wait in. Every corner held a piece of me. Pieces I'd either mourned or buried. But today I wasn't avoiding them. I was absorbing them. Finally, I turned the corner onto their street. The house looked exactly the same. Same faded siding. Same overgrown bush near the mailbox. Same wind chime near the porch that never really worked. I stood there for a full 5 minutes. I didn't knock. I didn't step closer. I just looked. Took it all in. Then the front door opened. It wasn't my father. It wasn't my mother. It was my brother. He stepped out slowly like he'd been watching from the window, waiting to see if I'd actually come. His face was thinner than I remembered. Older. More tired. But when our eyes met, something happened that neither of us expected. We both smiled. Not big dramatic smiles. Just enough to acknowledge, yeah, we're still here. He stepped aside, leaving the doorway open. Not a word. Just space. I hesitated. My hands were sweating. My heart pounding. But I stepped onto the porch. Each board creaked like it used to. I reached the threshold. The same doormat, a little more worn. And I walked in. Everything smelled the same, lemon cleaner and old books. The couch was new but the layout was the same. I glanced into the kitchen. Empty. But the chair I had pushed back that day was still there. No one had moved it. Or maybe they had, and just put it back. Then I heard it, her voice. She's here. It was my mother. Her voice coming from the hallway, laced with fear, hope, regret. I turned and saw her rounding the corner. Time hit her face harder than I expected. More lines, more weight in her eyes. She looked at me like I was a ghost. I didn't say anything. She didn't either. She just came forward. Slowly. Like approaching a wounded animal. And then, he hugged me. Tight. Desperate. Familiar. I didn't hug her back at first. My arms stayed limp, shocked by the contact. But slowly they rose. Found her shoulders. And for the first time in 5 years I let myself feel everything at once. The hurt. The absence. The impossible love. No apologies. No explanations. Just the press of two hearts that had been separated too long. My brother stood behind her watching. I could tell he was holding back tears. He wouldn't cry in front of me. That was still too vulnerable. But I appreciated the effort it took to stay present. Then a sound echoed from the hallway. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. My heart seized. Turned. And there he was. My father. He stood at the end of the hallway like a statue. His arms weren't crossed, but they might as well have been. The same look in his eyes. Calculated, unreadable, and so painfully familiar. Time had weathered his face, sure, but it hadn't softened it. His hair was grayer, his stance slightly more hunched, but he still carried himself with that quiet authority that once made me feel invisible. That once made me doubt the shape of my own heart. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. I hadn't heard his voice since the day he said, "You ruined this family." Now here we were. No kitchen table between us. No Sunday lunch, no witnesses. Just me and him. Two people who once shared a last name and now shared a wound. He didn't move. Neither did I. I felt my mother's hands on my back, gently retreating, as if giving us space to confront what could no longer be ignored. My brother lingered behind her, watching cautiously as if afraid the tension would explode into another fracture. Then finally my father spoke. His voice was quieter than I remembered. Rough as if unused. "You look older." Not, "I missed you." Not, "I'm sorry." Just an observation. Feck. I nodded. "So do you." A long pause stretched between us. He shifted his weight, glanced at the floor, then back at me. "Did you come to say something?" It wasn't hostile. But it wasn't kind either. It was loaded with something else. Defensiveness? Hope? Guilt? I swallowed hard. I hadn't rehearsed this moment. I thought I had, but standing there, all my prepared speeches vanished. All the imagined confrontations. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want an apology that sounded like duty. I wanted truth. His. Whatever we could salvage. I took a breath. "You said I ruined this family." He blinked. "I remember." "Did you mean it?" He didn't answer right away. Walked a few steps closer. Stopped halfway across the room. Looked at the old family photos still lining the hallway wall. Photos I had been removed from after I left. I was angry. "That's not an answer." "No," he finally said. "I didn't mean it. But I needed someone to blame. And you were brave enough to be different." Those words hit harder than I expected. Brave enough to be different. He said it like a compliment, but it carried years of confusion, disappointment, and maybe, just maybe, admiration he didn't know how to express. I took another step forward. "You broke me." His jaw tightened. "I know." Silence again. And then a moment I never saw coming. I didn't know how to be a father to someone I didn't understand. I had to sit down. That one sentence did what years of absence never could. It explained him, not excused, not forgave, but revealed. He wasn't just a man who hurt me. He was a man who had no tools for softness. No language for emotional connection. A man who thought discipline was love and obedience was loyalty. We sat across from each other. The couch between us felt like a bridge and a battlefield. Neither of us spoke for a long time. He tapped his fingers on his knee. I stared at the clock ticking above the mantel. And then, slowly, something unspoken settled in the room. Acknowledgement. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just the first brick laid on top of the rubble. My mother brought us tea. My brother disappeared into his room, not sure what to make of it all. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. But as he handed me the mug, his fingers trembled. And for the first time in my life I saw my father not as the voice that broke me, but as a man. Flawed. Lost. And maybe, like me, just trying to find a way home. That night, after the tea and the silence, my mother made up the guest room. The same one I used to sleep in when I had a fever, where I'd lie awake listening to her humming softly in the hallway. The sheets were new, but the mattress still made the same creaking sound when I lay down. And I lay down. But I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, counting the old cracks that were still there, as if time had passed through everything except that ceiling. My father's words echoed, and I couldn't tell if I felt relief or a new kind of ache. He hadn't apologized. But he hadn't run either. And somehow that moved me more than any rehearsed apology ever could. But then the doubt came, was that enough? Did admitting he didn't know how to father someone different heal anything? Or did it just open new questions? I got up in the middle of the night and walked to the kitchen. Same yellow light. Same chair tucked into the table. Without thinking, I sat down in it. That chair. The one I was in when he said it. "You ruined this family." I ran my fingers along the backrest like touching an old scar. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned slowly. It was my mother. Her face looked older, tired, but peaceful. She didn't ask why I was awake. She just sat down in the chair beside me like she had so many times before. She didn't speak at first. Just looked at me. Then finally, in a soft voice. The house got quieter after you left. I didn't reply. She continued. Not the kind of quiet that calms. The kind that haunts. That presses down on everything. I took a deep breath, trying to hold back a tear already forming. Why didn't you reach out? I asked. She bit her lip. Looked down at her hands. Because I thought I had already lost you. And I was afraid to lose you again. That answer broke me in a different way. Because it didn't come from logic. It came from fear. And fear I understood all too well. I needed you, I whispered. She looked at me like I was 10 again. Eyes wet, hands clasped tightly in her lap. I know. And I failed you. Because between you and him I chose silence. And silence swallows everything, even love. There wasn't anything left to say. Just feel. And I felt. I felt every day I had spent away. Every time I dreamed of this moment. And I realized, this wasn't like in the movies. There was no grand redemption. Just people. Flawed. Human. Ew. The next morning I had breakfast with my brother. He told me about school, about work, about relationships that never worked out. We laughed. Shared looks that said more than words. And in that moment I saw something I hadn't before. There was love. He just didn't know what to do with it back then. My father didn't come downstairs. My mother said he woke up early and went for a walk. Typical. He avoided what he couldn't control. And I no longer needed anything more from him. As I packed my things, I found the note my mother had written years ago. Tucked between 2 books on the shelf in my old room. I picked it up. Put it in my coat pocket. Smiled. Before I left, she hugged me again. Softer. More certain. You can come back whenever you want, she said. I know. But I might not. Even so, the door stays open. I left without drama. Without promises. Without needing anything else. As the train pulled out of the station, I looked out the window one last time. Saw the trees passing, the streets of my childhood fading behind. And I understood that I wasn't going back to my old home. I was going back to myself. And this time I didn't need anyone to tell me I was right. Because I knew. I didn't cry on the train ride back. Thought I might. I even brought tissues just in case. But the tears never came. Not because I wasn't feeling anything. On the contrary, I was feeling everything. It just didn't come out as tears. It came out as silence. As stillness. As breath. As this deep knowing that something had shifted in me for good. For so long I thought going back home would be like reopening a wound. That I'd bleed all over again, collapse back into the role I had fought so hard to escape. But that didn't happen. I didn't shrink. I didn't disappear. I walked into that house fully myself, and for the first time I wasn't begging to be understood. I wasn't hoping they'd say all the right things. I just showed up and I left with my soul intact. Back in the city nothing had changed. The buildings were the same. The streets still noisy. My apartment still smelled faintly of old books and lavender. But I had changed. I unpacked slowly, placing things back in their place like someone returning from a long expedition. Only this time I brought something back with me. Clarity. Of affection that I'd accept being half-loved just to feel included again. And yet that letter haunted me. I began dreaming of our old house. Of walking down the hallway barefoot, hearing my parents whispering in the kitchen. Of the smell of burnt toast and my mother humming. But even in my dreams the warmth would vanish. I'd reach for the doorknob and hear it again, his voice low and sharp, "You ruined this family." I'd wake up drenched in sweat, shaking. So I wrote a letter back. Not to send. Just to write. It was 5 pages long. I told her everything. How I cried myself to sleep in the beginning. How I hated them. How I missed them. How I blamed myself. And then how I stopped. I told her about the people I'd met. The version of me they never got to know. The version that didn't walk on eggshells. That didn't apologize for existing. I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope and sealed it. I didn't mail it. But something in me shifted. I was no longer writing for closure. I was writing because I needed to witness my own story, without edits, without denial, without shrinking. A few weeks later my phone buzzed. An unknown number. No name. Just a message. "I know I don't deserve to ask, but can we talk?" My breath caught. I stared at the screen for minutes. I wanted to throw the phone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say yes. It was my brother. He hadn't spoken to me in almost 5 years. Not once. Not even on my birthday. I didn't even know he still had my number. I sat on the floor reading the message again and again. Something about it felt off. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or pressure or a genuine olive branch. After hours of pacing, I replied with one word, maybe. We didn't talk that night. Or the next. But the door was open now, just enough for the air to change. And change it did. Fully. 3 days later I got another message. This time longer. He said he'd been thinking about me. That mom cried every holiday. That dad was still himself, but quieter. That they didn't talk about what happened, not really, but that it hung in the air, unspoken and heavy. He said he wished he'd said something that day in the kitchen. That he'd never forgotten how I looked when I left. That line shattered me. Because all this time I thought no one had even noticed. That I was a ghost in their memories. But he saw. He remembered. And maybe, just maybe, that meant there was still something there to rebuild. I called Olivia that night. I told her everything. She listened like she always did, without judgment, without interruptions. Then she said something I didn't expect. Maybe going back isn't about them. Maybe it's about you seeing that house with new eyes. I didn't sleep much. The idea kept echoing in my head. Going back, not for forgiveness. Not for peace. But to see it all. The walls, the silence, the table, through the lens of who I'd become. A week later I booked a train ticket to my hometown. Not a dramatic flight. Not some emotional confrontation. Just a slow, steady return. I didn't tell them I was coming. I needed to walk through that door on my own terms. To see if the ghost still lived there. To prove to myself that I could survive standing where I once shattered. Not as the girl who left. But as the woman who refused to stay broken. The train ride was quiet, long, and filled with a kind of silence I hadn't felt in years. Not the tense, suffocating silence of that kitchen. This one was different. This was the silence of intention. Of going back, not because I missed the people, but because I needed to reclaim the space. To see the house, the neighborhood, even the weather through new eyes. Through the eyes of someone who had finally chosen herself. I wore a gray coat that day. One I had bought with my first freelance paycheck. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like armor. On the train I kept picturing the house. The chipped paint. The porch swing. The tiny crack in the third stair on the way up. Every detail came back like a flood. But so did the emotions. The fear, the resentment, the longing. I didn't know which one would hit first when I stepped off the platform. When I arrived in town I didn't go straight to the house. I walked. Past the bakery where Mom used to buy pastries on Sundays. Past the park where I fell off my bike and cried into my dad's jacket. Past the old bookstore I loved but he never wanted to wait in. Every corner held a piece of me. Pieces I'd either mourned or buried. But today I wasn't avoiding them. I was absorbing them. Finally I turned the corner onto their street. The house looked exactly the same. Same faded siding. Same overgrown bush near the mailbox. Same wind chime near the porch that never really worked. I stood there for a full 5 minutes. I didn't knock. I didn't step closer. I just looked. Took it all in. Then the front door opened. It wasn't my father. It wasn't my mother. It was my brother. He stepped out slowly like he'd been watching from the window, waiting to see if I'd actually come. His face was thinner than I remembered. Older. More tired. But when our eyes met, something happened that neither of us expected. We both smiled. Not big dramatic smiles. Just enough to acknowledge, yeah, we're still here. He stepped aside, leaving the doorway open. Not a word. Just space. I hesitated. My hands were sweating. My heart pounding. But I stepped onto the porch. Each board creaked like it used to. I reached the threshold. The same doormat, a little more worn. And I walked in. Everything smelled the same, lemon cleaner and old books. The couch was new but the layout was the same. I glanced into the kitchen. Empty. But the chair I had pushed back that day was still there. No one had moved it. Or maybe they had, and just put it back. Then I heard it, her voice. She's here. It was my mother. Her voice coming from the hallway, laced with fear, hope, regret. I turned and saw her rounding the corner. Time hit her face harder than I expected. More lines, more weight in her eyes. She looked at me like I was a ghost. I didn't say anything. She didn't either. She just came forward. Fully. Like approaching a wounded animal. And then, he hugged me. Tight. Desperate. Familiar. I didn't hug her back at first. My arms stayed limp, shocked by the contact. But slowly they rose. found her shoulders. And for the first time in 5 years I let myself feel everything at once. The hurt. The absence. The impossible love. No apologies. No explanations. Just the press of two hearts that had been separated too long. My brother stood behind her watching. I could tell he was holding back tears. He wouldn't cry in front of me. That was still too vulnerable. But I appreciated the effort it took to stay present. Then a sound echoed from the hallway. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. My heart seized. Turned. And there he was. My father. He stood at the end of the hallway like a statue. His arms weren't crossed, but they might as well have been. The same look in his eyes. Calculated, unreadable, and so painfully familiar. Time had weathered his face, sure, but it hadn't softened it. His hair was grayer, his stance slightly more hunched, but he still carried himself with that quiet authority that once made me feel invisible. That once made me doubt the shape of my own heart. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. I hadn't heard his voice since the day he said, "You ruined this family." Now here we were. No kitchen table between us. No Sunday lunch, no witnesses. Just me and him. Two people who once shared a last name and now shared a wound. This doesn't mean denying the pain. Frankl never glorified suffering for its own sake. But he saw that suffering without meaning destroys, while suffering with meaning purifies. It forges the soul into something indestructible. Something sacred. And if you're listening to this now, perhaps your soul is aching. Maybe you've lost someone, or maybe you've lost yourself. Maybe the silence in your life has grown too loud. But listen, there is still one place untouched. One space the world cannot invade, your inner sanctuary. In that sacred space you can still decide, what will this pain mean? What will I do with it? Who will I become through it? Frankl emerged from the camps not with bitterness but with fire. Not with hatred but with wisdom. He saw that we are not simply products of our past, but creators of the present moment's meaning. That even when God is silent and the world cruel, you still have a soul, and that soul is sovereign. So let me ask you this. What suffering in your life needs to be rewritten by meaning? What dark moment needs the light of your inner choice? Because the truth is, you don't need to escape your pain to be free. You only need to give it a purpose. That is where freedom is reborn. Not outside but within. And when you do that, when you dare to find meaning in the very thing that tried to break you, you don't just survive. You resurrect. You become living proof that the soul is greater than the storm. There is a silence that does not come after noise, but before revelation. A silence so dense it feels like it presses against the walls of your chest. And it is in this silence that the soul begins to whisper. Not with words but with sensations. With a quiet knowing that bypasses thought. It is not the silence of peace, nor the silence of indifference, but the sacred pause that precedes awakening. The silence that Viktor Frankl knew intimately, not just in the concentration camps, but in the moments of staring into the abyss of meaninglessness and still choosing to look for light. Most people run from this silence. They fill it with sound, with people, with scrolling, with projects. Anything to avoid meeting themselves in the raw. But the ones who are truly transformed, the ones who rise from ashes not just alive but enlightened, are those who dare to remain. Who do not rush to interpret their pain but instead sit with it, letting it carve depth into their being. Frankl once wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response." But what he didn't say, at least not in those exact words, is that in that space also lives the voice of God. The sacred impulse. The pull toward meaning that cannot be logically explained but only spiritually recognized. And it is in this space that your soul pleads with you to stop resisting what you're becoming. You see, losing everything is not punishment. It is purification. It is the divine stripping away all that is false, all that is borrowed, all that is keeping you from seeing who you really are. And yes, it is brutal. Yes, it will feel like death. But on the other side of this internal funeral lies your resurrection. The rebirth of a version of you who no longer chases validation, who no longer fears silence, who no longer measures worth by what was taken away. This is not a journey of logic. If you try to understand it through reason alone, you'll end up bitter. Because logic doesn't make sense of heartbreak. It doesn't justify loss. But meaning transforms loss into sacred fuel. Meaning does not erase pain, but it makes the pain holy. And once something becomes holy, it can no longer control you. You begin to see that your story is not about what happened to you. It's about what awakened in you because of what happened. It's about the soul you unearthed when all else was buried. It's about how you started to hear God, not in temples or churches, but in the quiet after your screams. That's the part no one talks about. That's the part people skip over in their rush to heal. But Frankl knew. He knew that the path to meaning was not linear. It was cyclical, spiral, full of dark nights and quiet mornings. He knew that true transformation happens in the unseen, in the moments when you choose not to give up even though nothing around you makes sense. And now here you are. In that silence. Not because you failed, but because you finally stopped running. You finally stopped pretending that strength means noise. That healing means forgetting. That awakening means happiness. Sometimes awakening means grief. Sometimes it means falling to your knees and letting go of everything you thought you needed. Sometimes it means watching your identity burn so your essence can finally breathe. And in that breath, the first real breath after the death of your illusions, you hear something. A whisper. Gentle but undeniable. You're not lost. You're being led. That's how God speaks in the silence. That's how meaning begins. And that's how you realize you never had to lose yourself to find God. You only had to lose what wasn't truly you. There are moments when the soul cries out in despair and no answer seems to come from heaven. It is in these precise moments, of darkness, of uncertainty, of silence, that we either collapse or awaken. Viktor Frankl once said that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. But how can one find meaning in something as devastating as loss, abandonment, or the complete unraveling of one's life? How can we speak of meaning when everything seems meaningless? In the silence of suffering, God hides. Not as punishment, not as indifference, but as an invitation. An invitation to search deeper, beyond the superficial layers of faith taught in comfortable places. A calling to move past the idea of a God who fixes everything, and toward a God who forms us in the fire. Frankl discovered this in the camps. When there was no food, no freedom, no family, and yet, still, something remained. A whisper inside. Not loud. Not obvious. But real. The whisper of meaning. The quiet pull of something sacred that could not be taken even by death. We often look for God in the miraculous. In the healed body, in the restored relationship, in the sudden breakthrough. But Frankl shows us that perhaps the deepest encounter with the divine happens when there is no miracle. Only pain. And yet, we choose to go on. Because going on becomes the act of faith. It becomes the prayer. The offering. The sacred rebellion against despair. He would say, man is not destroyed by suffering. Man is destroyed by meaningless suffering. So the question is not how to avoid suffering. The question is how to look into the eyes of your suffering and say, you don't get the final word. What Frankl teaches, and what few dare to believe, is that you can lose everything and still hold on to the most important thing. The freedom to respond. To choose your attitude. To take your suffering and turn it into a testimony. And that's where God is. Not in the noise of religion, but in the silence of the human spirit rising from the ashes. Maybe that's why your prayers have gone unanswered. Maybe that's why everything fell apart. Not because you were abandoned, but because you were being initiated into a deeper faith, into a harder truth, into a love that doesn't rescue you from the storm, but walks with you through it. Frankl believed that man is not just shaped by his environment, but by the stance he takes toward it. And in that stance, in that sacred defiance, the presence of the divine is made known. So when everything is stripped away and you still choose love, still choose to forgive, still choose to stand, that's when God is closest. Not loud, not dramatic, but real, unshakable, eternal. There is a kind of silence that breaks a person. The silence after the prayer that goes unanswered. The silence after the diagnosis. The silence after the door closes and never opens again. In this silence the soul screams, but the heavens remain still. And that stillness feels like abandonment. But Frankl, having walked through the valley of death and despair, teaches us something different. He teaches us that silence is not the absence of God. Sometimes, it is his most profound language. In the concentration camps there were no pastors. No comforting scriptures read aloud. No choirs. No miracles. And yet there were moments of revelation. Not external. Not visible. But internal. Deeply sacred. A prisoner would share his last piece of bread. Another would whisper a word of hope before execution. And in those moments, something divine passed between them. Not in thunder. Not in lightning. But in love. That kind of love that makes no sense in hellish conditions. That kind of love that doesn't wait for blessings to begin. That kind of love that chooses to exist, even in the absence of everything. Frankl reminds us that the greatest freedom is not found in external liberation, but in the power to give your suffering meaning. And that meaning often comes through silence. When God doesn't answer, maybe it's because we're asking the wrong questions. Maybe the question is not, why is this happening to me? Maybe the real question is, who am I becoming because of this? In the darkest parts of our journey, our theology is stripped away. We no longer need clever phrases or polished prayers. We need truth. Raw, untamed, real. Anne Frankl's truth is this: pain is part of the path, but it doesn't have to define your destination. You define that by how you carry it. You define it by how you choose to respond. And here is the miracle most people miss. Sometimes when God is silent, He is listening more deeply than ever. Watching not what we say but who we become. Watching how we hold our integrity when no one is watching. Watching how we treat others when we ourselves are broken. It is in these moments that character is formed. It is in these moments that eternity watches closely. Frankl said that man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress. That is the spark. That is the fire that cannot be extinguished. That is the voice of God, speaking without sound. So if you are walking through silence right now, if you are carrying grief or betrayal or loss and heaven seems closed, don't walk away. Stay. Endure. Because even in the silence, something is shifting inside you. Not everything holy makes noise. Not everything sacred glows. Some things are invisible, but they are still real. Maybe even more real than the world outside. Frankl found that reality in suffering. And now so can you. Sometimes the loudest cries happen in silence. When the world expects us to break, we break. But then quietly something stronger grows within the cracks. Viktor Frankl understood this better than anyone. His experience taught him that the true revolution isn't loud or visible. It's internal, spiritual, and often goes unnoticed by the eyes of others. It's the quiet revolution of the soul that chooses meaning in the midst of suffering, hope when despair surrounds, and faith even when God feels distant. You see, after losing everything, family, freedom, identity, Frankl could have given in to bitterness. He could have let the silence consume him. But instead he used that silence as a canvas. A place to paint new meanings, to craft a new existence. This was no easy surrender. It required courage to sit with emptiness without flinching, to face the question, why me? Without escaping into anger or numbness. And it required faith. Faith in something larger than the suffering itself, something invisible but powerful. The quiet revolution is not about having all the answers. It is about embracing mystery and paradox. It's about accepting that sometimes God doesn't speak through booming revelations or spectacular miracles, but whispers in the stillness, in the spaces between thoughts, in the breath before the storm. Frankl showed us that it is in these moments of stillness that the soul finds its voice, not loud but undeniable. And this voice calls us beyond the pain and loss to something transcendent. It invites us to reclaim our freedom, not the freedom to control our circumstances, but the freedom to choose our response. To choose love instead of hate, purpose instead of despair, presence instead of escape. This is the revolution that changes everything. It is a rebellion against the idea that suffering must defeat us, that loss must define us. The journey is neither quick nor painless. It is a process, a gradual unfolding of strength hidden beneath vulnerability. It is a journey of waking up to the fact that the self we thought was destroyed was only covered in dust, waiting to be rediscovered. And with that rediscovery comes the realization that God was never truly absent. God was there in the very struggle, in the very moments we felt most alone. Frankl's life is a testament to this truth. Not because his suffering was less real or less harsh, but because he chose to find meaning within it. He chose to transform his pain into a message of hope for the world. And in doing so, he illuminated a path for all of us. One that leads not away from suffering but through it into a deeper, more authentic relationship with the divine. So if you are walking through your own dark night, know that your silence is not empty. It is filled with possibility. The quiet revolution is happening inside you right now. The soul is stirring. The spirit is rising. And though the road ahead may be long and uncertain, you are not alone. Because in this revolution, loss becomes gain, darkness becomes light, and in the stillness, God is whispering your name. The most profound freedom we can claim is not the freedom to control what happens to us, but the freedom to choose how we respond. Viktor Frankl's legacy teaches us this in the clearest terms. Life may throw its worst at us: loss, betrayal, isolation, but the last domain that no one can invade is the space between stimulus and response. It is in that space that the human spirit asserts its sovereignty. Choosing is not always easy. It often means confronting our darkest fears, our deepest wounds. It means looking at the scars not to hide them but to understand the story they tell. Choosing meaning over despair is a decision that must be renewed daily, sometimes minute by minute. It is a revolution of the heart. Frankl observed that those who survived the most horrific conditions were not necessarily the strongest physically, but those who saw a purpose beyond their pain. A reason to wake up each morning. A vision of a future worth enduring for. This is the power of meaning. It transforms suffering into a task, pain into a mission, and victimhood into agency. And yet, this freedom to choose does not mean denying reality. It does not mean ignoring injustice or glossing over trauma. On the contrary, it demands a fierce honesty, a brutal acknowledgement of the wounds life has dealt us. But within that truth lies a possibility. The possibility to rewrite our narrative, to author a life that honors our pain but refuses to be imprisoned by it. Imagine the weight that lifts when you recognize that you are not merely a product of what happened to you, but an active creator of what will come next. The power is staggering. The chains of blame and bitterness begin to crumble. And in their place, something stronger emerges. Hope born not from circumstance but from choice. This is not easy. It is a daily battle. But it is also the ultimate liberation. To say, I am more than my suffering. I am more than the roles I was forced to play. I am free to choose love, purpose, and courage. Frankl's example is a beacon in this darkness. His story reminds us that even in the worst prisons, literal or metaphorical, the human spirit remains unbroken when it claims its right to meaning. That suffering, while unavoidable, is never meaningless unless we allow it to be. So if you find yourself at a crossroads battered by life's storms, remember this. The most profound freedom is the one that cannot be taken from you. The freedom to choose your response. To say, in spite of everything, I will find meaning. I will find purpose. I will keep going. Because in that choice lies your true power. Your true self. Your true freedom. With freedom comes responsibility, a truth that Viktor Frankl knew well. Choosing to find meaning in suffering is not a passive act. It is a commitment, a sacred responsibility to oneself and to the world. When life breaks us down, the choice to rise again is not just for our own survival. It is an offering to the future, to those who will walk after us. Responsibility feels heavy. It demands courage. It asks us to face our pain honestly and use it as fuel for growth, not as a shield for bitterness. Frankl's life was a testament to this responsibility. He did not merely survive the camps. He dedicated his life afterward to helping others find their own path to meaning, their own light in darkness. This is the paradox of responsibility. It can feel like a burden, but it is also the source of our greatest power. It turns our suffering from something that weighs us down into something that lifts us up. When you accept responsibility for your life's meaning, you reclaim your voice in a world that often tries to silence it. You begin to see yourself not as a victim of circumstances but as a co-creator with the divine, shaping your reality with each choice, each act of courage, each moment of grace. It's a responsibility to live authentically, to be present, to love deeply, and to carry your scars not as shame but as proof of survival. Frankl understood that this responsibility is not given lightly. It asks for honesty, for patience, for the willingness to walk through dark nights again and again. But it also promises something priceless: the chance to live a life that matters no matter how hard the path. So if you feel overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility today, remember that it is also the key to your freedom. It is the bridge from suffering to meaning, from loss to purpose, from silence to the sacred voice of your soul. There is a darkness so deep that it feels infinite, an abyss where hope seems swallowed whole. We all encounter that abyss at some point. the moments when the night stretches endlessly and the heart feels broken beyond repair. Viktor Frankl knew this abyss intimately. Yet within that darkness he discovered a hidden light. A light not born of circumstance, but born from the human spirit's refusal to surrender. This light is subtle. It does not blaze like the sun or shout like thunder. Instead, it glimmers quietly, like a single star visible only when the sky is at its darkest. It is the light of meaning, of purpose, of resilience. It is the spark that says, I will endure. I will rise. I will find beauty even here. To find that light, you must first face the abyss without flinching. You must allow yourself to feel the weight of loss, the sting of betrayal, the ache of loneliness. You must hold your broken pieces with tenderness rather than judgment. This is not weakness, it is courage. The courage to be vulnerable, to be raw, to be human. Frankl teaches us that the abyss is not the end. It is a passage. A crucible where the soul is purified and transformed. The pain does not disappear, but its meaning changes. It becomes a teacher, a guide, a companion on the journey toward a deeper life. When you look into the abyss and see that light, you begin to understand something profound. Your suffering is not meaningless. It is a thread woven into the tapestry of your becoming. It is the soil from which new growth springs. This is the paradox of the human experience. In losing we gain. In suffering we awaken. In darkness we find light. So if you are standing at the edge of your own abyss today, know that you are not alone. There is a light waiting for you there, quiet, steadfast, eternal. And it is yours to claim. The journey through darkness, silence, and suffering is never a straight path. It twists, it turns, it loops back on itself. Viktor Frankl's story, and the story you're living, reminds us that healing is not about forgetting the pain, nor erasing the past. It is about embracing the whole of who we are, the broken and the beautiful, the lost and the found. Coming home doesn't always mean returning to a place. Sometimes it means returning to yourself. To the part of you that was never truly lost, even when everything else was stripped away. It means recognizing that your scars are not signs of failure, but marks of survival and strength. In the end, Frankl taught us that life's ultimate meaning is found not in comfort or certainty, but in the courage to keep choosing purpose, even when the future is unknown. It is the courage to say yes to life with all its suffering and joy, its questions and mysteries. Your story, like his, is a testament to that courage. A living example that even in the darkest nights, the human spirit can shine with a light that nothing can extinguish. So as you move forward, carry this truth with you. You are not alone. Your pain has a purpose. Your silence holds a song. And your life, no matter how shattered or whole, is a sacred journey toward meaning, love, and peace. The path home is not a destination. It is a daily act of faith, a constant choosing, a quiet revolution within. And in that revolution you find God. Not always in thunder or light, but in the still, unwavering presence that walks with you, through the abyss, through the silence, through the storm, until you come home.